Hi, I'm Carl Sweeney.
And I'm Raquel Stecher, and this is the CineHistorians podcast, where we explore the history of cinema from across the globe.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the CineHistorians podcast. As ever, I am one of your hosts, Carl Sweeney, and I'm joined by my other podcast co-host, Raquel Stecher. Hi, Raquel.
Hey, Carl, how's it going?
Yeah, it's going well, and it's nice to be back for another season 2 episode of the podcast. We kicked off the season very recently. We are covering, for this season, our topic is the Sight and Sound list, the critics list of the greatest films of all time. We talked about a big one last time out with Jeanne Dielman and a Chantal Akerman film. And it's a big one today as well, because we're talking about Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo from 1958. So a film that's been endlessly discussed over the years, and it remains a fascinating film. So yeah, Raquel, like I said, it's an interesting topic this season that we've got. We talked a bit more extensively last time out about the Sight and Sound list and the history of Sight and Sound and things like that. But yeah, essentially, we've chosen several films from that 2022 list to cover at length on this season of CineHistorians. Raquel has chosen half of them. I have chosen half of them. This one is my pick. And I think a logical pick because of the history of this film on the list, which we're going to come on to.
Yes.
But Raquel, for listeners and viewers, many of whom will know Vertigo, you never know, some might be seeing the film for the first time, be hearing about it for the first time. Did you want to give listeners an introduction to the film?
I will. And just to warn you, there are spoilers, so just be prepared. So Vertigo is based on the novel D'Entre les Morts, which is also known in English as The Living and the Dead, by writing duo Pierre Boileau and Thomas Narcejac. They're the same writing duo who penned the novel that would be adapted into the French film Le Diabolique, which Carl and I talked about on his podcast, The Movie Palace, and I'll make sure to leave a link in the description box so you guys can listen to that episode. I highly recommend it. So Vertigo stars James Stewart as Scotty Ferguson. He's a San Francisco police detective who suffers from acrophobia, which is a fear of heights. And this acrophobia induces vertigo, which is a sensory disruption that induces the feeling of spinning. So his phobia causes a police officer to fall to his death as the two are chasing down a criminal over these rooftops. And because of the incident, Scotty is forced to retire. Not really sure what to do with himself, he spends his time with his friend Midge, played by Barbara Bel Geddes. She's in love with him, but it's clear that the feeling isn't mutual. Scotty is hired by an old college friend, Gavin Elster, played by Tom Helmore, to trail his wife, Madeleine, played by Kim Novak, because she seems to be possessed with the spirit of her dead ancestor, Carlotta Valdez. Scotty stalks Madeleine, observing her strange behavior, becoming more and more fixated on her, and everything escalates to the point where Madeleine runs up to the top of a bell tower at a church and jumps off to her death. Or so we thought. After Scotty is tried by the court for his involvement and institutionalized. And then he sees Judy Barton, a young woman who bears a striking resemblance to Madeleine. And we learn that Madeleine was just playing the wife of Galvin and that the real wife was pushed to her death. But Scotty doesn't know that yet. He becomes obsessed with Judy, forcing to change every aspect of her appearance until she looks like Madeleine. And the first cycle repeats as he takes her to the same church and the same bell tower as before. And big spoiler alert, this time she actually is the one who falls off the bell tower to her death.
Okay, thanks, Raquel, for that introduction to the film. And at this point, what I'll do is I'll give some background on the director of the movie, Alfred Hitchcock. Fairly straightforward to say, somebody who's commonly regarded as, one of the most known and notable filmmakers ever. What I think is so interesting about Hitchcock is that he kind of straddles that divide between high art and low art. So a very popular entertainer, but somebody where it took a while until opinion really solidified that he was actually a bit more than that. So I've got a book from 1965 by Robin Wood called Hitchcock's Films, and it begins with the sentence, "Why should we take Hitchcock seriously?" And it's interesting because Wood he feels like he needs to spend a lot of time actually addressing that question. But of course, the pendulum well and truly swung. You know, Hitchcock, he had been championed in France by the auteurist critics, people like Francois Truffaut. Um, and one of the reasons for that is because he was one of the main directors in that Hollywood system who they felt was able to have this really personal signature across a body of work. So people will know Hitchcock for his key themes. He's known, of course, as the master of suspense. People will have heard of tropes like the Hitchcock blonde. People will know that he makes stories about innocent men on the run, as well as stories about murder, stories about guilty women, stories about espionage. But that quote from Wood, I think, is interesting because even at that point, even in the 1960s, people were querying this desire to take Hitchcock seriously. But I think if we fast forward to the present day, he's well and truly entrenched in the critical canon of great filmmakers. And Raquel will tell us about that shortly in relation to Sight and Sound and the Sight and Sound list. But yeah, I think Hitchcock's films endure, or many of them do, because they still entertain people, but they also have rich artistry. They can really stand up to detailed analysis. And I think Vertigo is a great example of that. I think the other thing worth mentioning as quick background is, of course, Hitchcock cultivated this quite distinctive persona at a time when that was fairly uncommon for film directors. You know, people looked out for his cameo appearances in his own films. People will have known him from his anthology television series and the introduction to those episodes. People will have seen him appear in trailers for movies like Psycho and The Birds. And he became such a known and familiar person, you know, to the point that he could be identified just by his silhouette, of course, famously. So that's a very broad brush introduction to Hitchcock, Raquel. Obviously, if there's anything you want to add to that, feel free. Or you could tell us about the history of Vertigo on the Sight and Sound list, of course, as well.
You can't forget about the MacGuffin too, the famous like plot device where it drives the plot, but and like at the end it doesn't really mean anything. That seems to be very classic Hitchcock. So Vertigo actually first appeared on the Sight and Sound top 10 list in 1982. So not even in Alfred Hitchcock's lifetime, since he passed away in 1980. So in its first appearance, it tied for 7th place, and then it climbed up with each list. In 1992, it was in 4th place. In 2002, it was in 2nd place. And in 2012, it was announced that Vertigo bumped Citizen Kane from the top spot, which it had held for every single list since it had first appeared in 1962. And Vertigo got that #1 spot. And that caused quite a stir because of Citizen Kane's like dominance on the list, but also there was so much discourse about Citizen Kane being the greatest film of all time. So Vertigo being #1 put that into question, but also had a lot of people discussing whether Vertigo was worthy of that recognition of being #1. And it's interesting to note that the race between Citizen Kane and Vertigo for that top spot in 2012 wasn't even close. It was a difference of 34 votes, which is quite a lot. Citizen Kane received a total of 157 votes, and Vertigo got 191. So fast forward to 2022, and both Vertigo and Citizen Kane were bumped down a number by Gene Dealman, which we talked about in the last episode, like you had said. So now Vertigo is #2 and Citizen Kane is #3. And Vertigo was actually the only Alfred Hitchcock film to make it on the list for years until 2012, when the list became 100 instead of just 10. And that year, Psycho was added and it tied for 34th place. And North by Northwest and Rear Window tied against each other for the 53rd spot. And all 4 of those films stayed on in the most recent list in 2022. Vertigo at #2, and Psycho moves up to 31, Rear Window to 38, and North by Northwest to 45th spot. So having 4 films in the top 100 greatest films of all time is quite a mark. It definitely shows the legacy of Alfred Hitchcock's canon.
It really does. And I had wondered with the 2022 list whether Vertigo, I didn't think it was going to stay on the top spot. I didn't quite predict which film would replace it,
Yeah.
but I thought Vertigo would fall a little bit. And I was actually a little surprised it didn't fall further. I don't quite know why, but I just kind of anticipated that in 2022 it would have had a target on its back a little bit, and people would have been trying to displace it, but clearly not. Clearly, it still has a sufficient level of critical support to be right up there. It'd be very interesting to see where it places in 2032, whether it's still vying for the top spots. I suppose in terms of starting our general thoughts, Raquel, what's really interesting to note off the back of what you've just said, which is that it has sometimes been regarded as the greatest film ever made. It's often right up there in that discussion, even if it's not quite hitting the top spot in every single list. Actually, it had a very mixed reception on initial release back in the 1950s, which is very, very fascinating to me. So I can read out a few quick quotes and then I'll throw it over to you for your thoughts. But in The New Yorker, John McCartan called the film far-fetched nonsense. In the Saturday Review, Arthur Knight said, technical facility is being exploited to gild pure dross. And actually, in the original Sight and Sound review by Penelope Houston, she said, one is agreeably used to Hitchcock repeating his effects, but this time he's repeating himself in slow motion. So not at all heralded as a classic across the board to begin with. We know that's often the case with films that come on to be regarded as great, that people don't quite see it immediately.
Yeah.
But yeah, what do you make of that initial response, Raquel, and what do you make of the film itself?
It's funny because this film, I think the main criticism is the plot. I mean, it's not even a film that people like for the plot. I mean, it takes like interesting like turns and twists, and the flashbacks and revelations are really fun. But if you look at Hitchcock's other work, it's not his best storyline. Like the twist in Psycho, much more compelling. The element of obsession as like the core of the plot works better in like Rear Window. And even like paranoia or fear, like I like how those are played out in North by Northwest and The Birds, and even like heights as like a scary element. I just think of like that shot of Norman Lloyd falling off the Statue of Liberty in Saboteur. That is such a great moment. But I think people may look at it as like a plot driven movie, and then that is maybe where they see weakness. But I think what makes Vertigo stronger is that it's like richly layered and complex, because it deals with so many themes in such an amazing way. Like there's obsession, possession, mental illness, even like domestic violence, betrayal, loyalty, and these characters are complex. The visual framing is really fascinating. The camera techniques, the color, the costume and set design, and then the romantic backdrop of San Francisco, it makes it all kind of look dreamlike. And also to have like this deeply flawed hero too, who you're kind of rooting for, but who also does bad things. He's not a villain, but he's a disturbed man, and you kind of like are rooting for him too. I think that's what makes this film strong. But then I can also see sort of that surface element where like the plot, maybe you're like, wait, that really didn't work. That didn't quite make sense, and maybe that's what puts people off. And then also when you watch it for the first time, that's your reaction. You're reacting to the plot. And then on further viewings, that's when you start to really get that richness.
Yeah, you sort of realize later that the plot is just what allows Hitchcock to do all these other things, which are more interesting. Because, yeah, the plot is, firstly, it kind of unravels if you spend enough time thinking about it. Yes. Like, so the whole plan to kill Elster's actual wife, it's kind of found, and Hitchcock says this himself to Francois Truffaut in their book of interviews. How could Elster have known for sure that Scotty wouldn't have been able to get all the way up the tower? How does he know that Scotty won't come down to the ground and inspect the dead body? It's, if you wanted to kill somebody, this is not the way you would actually do it in like a kind of logical plausible way.
It's very elaborate.
It's insanely elaborate, but also it's a very kind of languid way to do that plot. So kind of the pacing is a little different to what you might expect. It has all these little loose ends, doesn't it? Like we never actually find out what happens to Gavin Elster. Has he been caught? Has he not been caught? the film doesn't actually tell us. Um, we never find out, for example, what's going on with the hotel owner in the first part of the film. Like the hotel owner who says, "We haven't seen that woman today. She's not here." Is that woman in on it? Has she been paid by Elster? Does she actually not know that Kim Novak's character is there? So that's what I mean when I say when you start to think about this film, it kind of unravels on that level of if you're very fixated on the plot, this is maybe not the Hitchcock film for you. In fact, it could have been more plot heavy, but that was kind of toned down a little bit during the scripting phase. So there's this whole thing about the necklace, and at one point in the script has Scotty kind of exploring the possibility that it might be a duplicate necklace, or maybe she bought it secondhand. And actually, that's kind of minimized for the finished film. So the plot elements are kind of dialed back a little bit.
Right.
But yeah, so it does have that different, more kind of languid, relaxed approach to plotting than you might expect from other Hitchcock films, than you might expect from other films from Hollywood of that era. So it has this kind of strange feeling, I think. I suppose it's interesting to think about it in terms of the late 50s, isn't it? Because it's a time when Hollywood is kind of taking on television with these big spectacles, and Vertigo kind of is part of that because it has this grand VistaVision presentation. And of course, it's a time when Hitchcock himself is involved with television. So in the BFI book about Vertigo, the writer Charles Barr has an interesting point by saying that actually Vertigo in some ways is closer to the Alfred Hitchcock TV series than any film he had made before this point, which people normally say that about Psycho because it's black and white and it has the TV crew working on it. But in Vertigo, what he's saying is it's got this abrupt twist, and one of the writers on the film, Alec Koppel, would actually write he wrote for Hitchcock's TV series. So do you know what I mean? It's a strange film. 1958 is a strange point in Hollywood history. This is one of the strangest films that comes at around that point, if you see what I mean. It kind of, it's pulled in different directions, I suppose is what I'm saying.
As somebody who has seen every episode of the Alfred Hitchcock Hour, not Presents, Hour, the twist in the story is the fun part. It's the reason you're watching the little 1 hour movie. And the plot, the plots in order to get to that fun twist, you kind of have to suspend your disbelief a little bit, but that's what makes it so fun. And I just think with Vertigo, it does compete really nicely with television because it's a twist, but then you have this beautiful technicolor visual imagery that you're not going to get on a black and white television, and it's got all this other stuff that it can do that maybe television couldn't do. I actually really think that with this viewing that I did, I really took note of like the sexual theme in the story. I think it's really interesting, and you have like this middle-aged man who's almost like emotionally impotent. He has this woman, Midge, who's sweet, she's loyal, she's smart, she's hardworking, she's always there, but he does not want her. And it's funny too, she also calls him Johnny, where everyone else calls him Scotty. So he has this like safe life ready to go, but he doesn't want it. Instead, he wants Madeleine, who's like sophisticated, she's the image of wealth, because like Midge works, she doesn't, and she's like emotionally unavailable and complex and mysterious. You could see how he would be excited by that, and she's not fully available like Midge is. And we see images of him, like he's holding her in his arms, she's in his bed, he has her wear his bathrobe, there's embraces, there's kisses, but like he doesn't actually end up consummating the relationship. And so when he finds Judy, she's not quite Midge, but he could make her into Madeleine. And if you think about it, this is where like sort of the psychosexual element comes in, because he goes mad transforming Judy into Madeleine so he can fulfill that like desire he has. He's like, we see him like dragging her along, he's forcing her to change her wardrobe. And he changes her hair, and it's not enough to change her hair. She has to wear that French twist swirl, and that sort of represents that that fear he has, that trigger he has with the vertigo and the fear of heights, and he fixates on that specific detail, and it's almost like that is what triggers the arousal in the story. It's that spiral in the hairs. So I think even when you focus on elements like that in the story, there's like so much you can analyze. This is just one element of many themes in the story, and you can spend hours just really digging and breaking things apart and really analyzing things. And for people like us, we love that stuff. That adds so much elements to it. And also other filmmakers love that stuff too. They want to see how it's done, how they could interpret that in their own movies.
Exactly. And I think just hearing the description, you realize actually what a strange film it is. And I think
Yeah.
part of that strangeness is what might have put people off in 1958, but is actually what keeps people returning to the film over the years, because how odd and how personal it seems for a big Hollywood production is really striking. And like you said with the other filmmakers, I saw a quote from Martin Scorsese talking about that. He said exactly that it's the personal element that has sustained the film over the years. Scorsese said it gives a very, very troubling look at humanity in a way, but it's something that's honest and true. So I think the way a lot of people would have read this film is kind of like the Scotty character, the James Stewart character, is almost like a stand-in for Alfred Hitchcock himself.
Yeah.
Like a man who's got these kind of private anxieties, who's got this level of fixation, who's trying to turn this woman into something actually unattainable. She's trying to turn this woman into kind of this vision he has of her.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a nice way to read it. And I think people have often said, I think it goes back to maybe it's Donald Spotto's, one of his books on Hitchcock that first brings it up. But the idea that Hitchcock liked to cast James Stewart as somebody who's got his own frailties, whereas he liked to cast Cary Grant as someone who was a bit more of an idealized version of Hitchcock.
Yeah.
So I like that reading of it. I also actually quite like the idea of Hitchcock. Maybe the Hitchcock stand-in in the film is Gavin Elster, because he's the character who's off screen. He's the one who's actually pulling the strings and doing the manipulation in the story.
Yeah.
So I was thinking a little bit more about that this time, but I don't think that cancels out the other reading. I think maybe they're both kind of Hitchcock stand-ins. But I don't know. Do you see that in the James Stewart character, particularly this kind of, like I say, Scotty is kind of a Hitchcock surrogate of sorts?
Yeah, I totally see that because Alfred Hitchcock's obsession with his blondes in his movies, how he fixates on a particular blonde actress and makes her the star of his movie. Like there's this obsession and this sort of like sexual desire that is also not like fulfilled, but is fulfilled to whatever point he can get to because he has her in his movie. So I can see that element. And then, yeah, I can see definitely him sort of channeling himself through the Galvin Esther character because this is a guy behind the scenes. He's funding this project and allowing somebody else, like Hitchcock is allowing James Stewart to fall in love and get the girl, and he's behind the scenes kind of orchestrating this to happen.
Yeah.
So I can see both sides.
Yeah, it's like Elster has cast Scotty in the storyline he is making. If you read it that way, so actually there's quite a bit to it.
It's all meta.
I think the casting is really on point because Stewart is great, and he, obviously has the everyman image. It is easy to forget just how good he was at going to the dark side, and even in a film like It's a Wonderful Life, for example, he's very good at that when he has to. Obviously, in some of the Hitchcock films, in the westerns he made with Anthony Mann, he could do that extremely well, and he does it here. Kim Novak as well, I think, is fantastic casting.
Yeah, I agree.
Hitchcock talked about how it was kind of difficult to get exactly what he wanted from Novak because she came in with a lot of her own ideas around things. In the interview I watched with her, she talked about adoring working with Hitchcock for her part, but she said that they worked a lot together on getting the right rhythm of speech. But you kind of wonder, because I think Hitchcock's original idea here was to cast Vera Miles in Kim Novak's role, and Vera Miles
Right.
got pregnant, and that didn't happen. Vera Miles plays the sister in Psycho later on, for example, but I just don't. Maybe she could have pulled it off, but when you see the kind of enigmatic quality Novak's got here, you think that actually this happened in exactly the right way ultimately. At least that's what I think. What do you think?
Yeah, and I like how she plays these two versions of the same woman. And she does it like it's done visually. There's a huge difference between how um, Madeleine is groomed with her blonde hair, her French twist, and her makeup and her clothes, and then how Judy is. But she also plays them very differently too, because like Madeleine is disturbed but she's also like sophisticated and she feels intensely, but in a different way. And then Judy is like young and she's brash and she feels emotional and intense in a different way. And she plays them really quite well. And there's also something really striking about her image and how she has these different images on screen. And how she carries herself, that those beautiful shots of her profile, the way she enters a room, like that shot of her going through the doorway at the Ernie's restaurant is so striking. So I think she's a really great fit for this, and it's really unlike anything else that she played.
Yeah, and I suppose to bring things slightly back to the critical reception of this film and the sight and sound list and all of that, one of the things I was kind of wondering about is how the fact that Vertigo came to have a quite elusive status. I wonder how much that has affected the way people came to think of the film, because what happened is it became quite hard to see the film in a good print after its initial
Yeah.
release. Actually, in England, many screenings after the initial release were in black and white, and I think so much of the impact of this film is about the use of color that must have been
Yes.
a real shame. Um, and then there's a period when it becomes hard to see the film at all, because Vertigo is one of five Hitchcock films, and I think the others are Rope, Rear Window, The Trouble with Harry, and the second version of The Man Who Knew Too Much.
Mhm.
Basically, the rights reverted back to the Hitchcock estate, and the film was kept away from view for more than a decade, in spanning between the 70s and the 80s. There's a re-release in 1983, but the restoration that really captures or recaptures like the visual splendor of the film doesn't come until later on in the 1990s. So it has that very interesting history, I think, Vertigo, where, like I say, it kind of fades from view until it comes back, and it's kind of crossing over with the period where it's slowly gaining on Citizen Kane in that Sight and Sound list. So I don't know. Do you think that might have had some effect on the way critics really like latched onto this film? Did it give it like a kind of hidden allure or something like that?
I think that's what's interesting about the sight and sound list actually is accessibility. If a film is not available or really hard to get, you have, it's got a smaller audience and a smaller group of people who are going to really appreciate it. But when you increase that accessibility, that's when you get a lot more discussion, a lot more analysis, a lot more appreciation and sharing of a film. And that really, I mean, if you look at the top 100 greatest films of all time, you have to look at accessibility. These films have to be accessible to be appreciated. And I think that goes to say, just like with, what Truffaut did for Hitchcock to really kind of bring him into esteem. And then sort of Hitchcock's like sort of legacy tour at the end of his life where he's doing a lot of television appearances. I'm just thinking of like him on Dick Cavett or something. And he continues his celebrity. And then in the later years, and after his death, just how his films are starting to be reappreciated. It just does a lot. Like it raised, if that none of that happens, then these films might still be obscure. We still not might not be able to appreciate them, or it might be such a small group of people who are really championing them.
Yeah, that's a good point. I suppose because like we said, those initial reviews were not. It's not that people were necessarily panning the film, but
Mm-hmm.
often it was like faint praise. It was like another one I didn't mention, but the monthly film bulletin in that magazine. The reviewer complained about the length of the film. sort of saying it gives you too much time to think about the logic, basically, and you realize. I mean, we kind of talked about how there's a fair point there, but maybe there is a bit of absurdity to the plot, to Elster's plan. So the
even in
film,
even in the 2012, like the September 2012 edition of Sight and Sound magazine, when it's announced that Vertigo beat out Citizen Kane, even though one of the articles complains about Vertigo not being that good, and Citizen Kane not being that good, so so there's even still criticism today.
yeah, of course, and like you said, maybe there's a world where that never really changed after 1958, but that's not what happened here.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say quickly, and I know you might mention, I know you're going to talk about the tower sequences later in the episode, but the ending, the power of the ending really did hit me on this viewing, because it's kind of like, that mix of, at the start of the film, if Scotty has a goal of sorts, it's kind of like, well, how can he cure this vertigo? And that's not an easy thing. And that's kind of resolved in a way at the end of the film, and yet in the most tragic of circumstances. So that image of Stewart looking over the edge at the end of the movie really, I think, is incredibly powerful stuff.
And it goes back to something Mitch said, that in order to get rid of his fear of heights, something kind of needs to shock him out of it. And this is the thing that shocks him out of it. And it also is what kills his desire for Madeleine. Not necessarily that she's dead, but that like he was able to like come to this realization of what really happened and confront her. And then it just ends, and he doesn't have to worry about her anymore. It's really interesting.
It is. So it's like you were saying earlier with the layers, it's like a mixture of conflicting things going on there, actually. And that's what makes it such a rich film to revisit, I think. Okay, Raquel, so there's quite a lot with this movie in terms of key moments and things. Before we get there, is there anything else you wanted to say on a more general level about Vertigo?
No, I'm excited to keep diving in.
Okay, in that case, then let's take a very quick break, and then we'll come back and talk a bit more about the movie. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to CineHistorians. We are still here talking about Vertigo, and key moments is a fascinating one, because potentially we could have chosen a lot of different things from this movie, but we've got a nice selection, I think, Raquel.
Yes.
I wanted to kick us off with the first appearance of Madeleine. So this is in Ernie's restaurant. It's when, of course, we see Scotty there and he looks over to her. So I think it's a sequence with just stunning visual impact, basically. The slow movement of the camera across the restaurant. And because it's a slow movement, we really take in things like the decor. Of course, we pick out Kim Novak in that evening dress. We watch her kind of glide through the restaurant. We don't hear her speak. We don't see her entire face. She walks into that beautiful close-up shot in profile. I just think it's a very memorable way to establish her as like the object of this romantic, or at least what starts off as a seemingly romantic quest. It really nails that down immediately. And actually interesting the way it's done, because it's not one of the scenes that's relying on things like point of view shots, but it still draws us into Scotty's perspective really successfully. I think we see her as the audience in much the same way that he sees her. The other thing that's interesting about it as a scene, I think, is that, like I say, it's pretty sumptuous stuff. And because it's full of really well executed technical elements, it's a great scene to look at as an example of how there's this kind of collaborative synergy going on in a big Hollywood movie. So in the BFI book about the film, Charles Barr kind of really highlights this, because, okay, it tells us something about Hitchcock, but it also tells us something about the way this film was made. Ernie's has been built on a soundstage. So Hitchcock's very dependent on people like Henry Bumstead for the art direction, Edith Head for the costume, Bernard Herrmann, of course, for the music is so memorable in that scene too.
Yeah.
Nellie Manley for the hairstyling, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a scene, it's kind of neat to look at it in that way. Like, it's a great scene for the style, and we can sort of think about it in terms of this personal obsession that's going on. You need a whole team to make something that impactful with this kind of movie, and it's kind of nice to look at it from that perspective too. So that's why basically I wanted to choose the first appearance of Madeleine as a standout scene.
No, I agree that that shot of her in the emerald green and black dress, like in the midst of this very red restaurant with the red upholstery on the chairs, but also the red wallpaper is just really striking. And yeah, those camera angles are really
Mm.
interesting. How it gives you're part of that gaze, even though we're not getting, like you said, the POV shot. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned the green dress there, Raquel, and I think actually the color green is something you've highlighted as really interesting here. Is that right?
Yes, I think the color in Vertigo is just fascinating to analyze. Like the red and the green are the two like dominant colors in the movie, and there's you also see some like significance with like blue and pink and a little bit with lavender, but red seems to be closely associated with James Stewart's character. And it could, signify like passion, obsession, death, blood. And it fits with like the intensity of his character, but like I really wanted to talk about just the green, which is tied closely with Kim Novak and her as Madeleine and Judy. And like you had said with the that great introduction to Madeleine and Ernie's restaurant, and it's just such a striking image with her. Like we're introduced to her in green and a sea of red. Um, and and if red is associated with Scotty and she's green, this is basically her entering his world. Like this is his
Mm.
for her first entrance. And we see green follow her character like throughout. She drives a green car around the city. She goes to places where there is greenery, like the flower shop or the cemetery at the church. Later on in the film, when Scotty rescues her, and you see that shot of the Golden Gate Bridge, bright red in the background, is really interesting. And he takes her back to his apartment, which has a bright red door with a green frame. And there's so many elements here. And fine, so this is the moment where he actually has her in his possession. She's in his home, and he's wearing a green sweater, and I think that's a great visual symbol. Then now he has her in his possession, and he dresses her in a red robe, like another visual symbol of possession. And the green actually comes up in conversation. The two are in the redwood forest. They're talking about the sequoia trees, and then Scotty says that the scientific name is Sequoia sempervirens, and the sempervirens part means always green, ever living. And this is when like green starts to take a new meaning. It's like the symbolic representation of living women. She's playing the part of somebody who's living at the moment. She pretends to be possessed by a dead ancestor, so she's like reviving a person into an existence through like this performance, and then she's about to be rebirthed back into her like what is supposedly her real identity as Judy Barton. And what's interesting, Judy Barton also wears green. She's in a green dress, but it's totally different from the first dress. It's not this luxurious emerald green dress. It's just like she's a working woman and she's just wearing this little bright green dress like she's going off to work. And when we see Scotty and Matt and Judy together, she's wearing some form of green. And when he transforms her into Madeleine, there's even more green. Like Judy lives in a hotel with a big green neon sign that says, I think, Hotel Empire. And that green, like the light from the neon sign, flashes into her apartment. So when they're in the apartment scenes, there's always this like green hue. And when she makes her final visual transformation into Madeleine, there's this great shot of her in like a green haze, like as she walks into the light. It's just really fascinating how the green is matched to her character. And if you think about the significance of green just in art in general, like you have in this case, it's like the symbol of the character, but also of living. Shakespeare's Othello, green is jealousy. Iago warns Othello that jealousy is the green-eyed monster. For years, green pigment was made of arsenic. It's why Monet went blind, so green pigment was closely associated with poison. And Vertigo takes place in the US and our money is green. So you can sort of see that as like this symbol of greediness. Like the James Stewart character is always wanting more. He's very greedy and she's represented in green. So you can also make that association. It's really fascinating. I could even go into red, but I think green for me was my favorite.
Yeah, and it just highlights to me how much I wish I could have seen the film in its first run in that kind of like spectacular
Oh, yeah.
VistaVision projection, because I think, I mean, they still look fantastic in the restoration, of course, but I think it would have been great to, Scorsese talked about the impact of that as being quite remarkable. Um, okay, so I then wanted to choose the kind of revelation scene that comes later in the film, although not perhaps as late as we might have expected. So the revelation being that Judy is Madeleine, etc. The scene where Scotty leaves her and she writes the letter, and we see the flashback to her with Elster and Elster's actual wife about to be thrown off the tower. Yeah, it comes earlier in the picture than you might expect. It probably catches the first time viewer somewhat off guard, although it's interesting to note that the theatrical trailer in 1958, it's very clear that Kim Novak is playing a twin role, a dual role. So
Yeah.
it'd be interesting to know exactly how surprised people were back then. What it certainly does is it gives you a new relationship to Scotty. It's the first time that now we know something that he doesn't. We've spent the whole film knowing the same things that he does. And now we're kind of waiting and wondering, like, how is he going to find out? And also, and crucially, what will he do when he does find out? So it kind of shifts the perspective at a key stage in the film. I think it also gives us a new perspective on Judy, actually. So now Kim Novak is playing someone who's not this impassive, beautiful object that she seemed to be earlier. She's caught up in a very, treacherous plan. She's played some kind of role in that plan herself. It makes you realize there's more to that character than we had realized. I like it where it comes in the film. I think there's some discussion around that. Should it have come later or even earlier? I think the risk, if that had been placed at the end, or if we'd only learnt those things at the end, that's a lot to process during that tower sequence, for example. The film could really get bogged down there, I think. What's interesting is that there are conflicting accounts of whose idea this kind of confessional flashback sequence actually was. I'm actually going to mention what Hitchcock said in a later segment, but in short, he said it was his idea. In the BFI book, Charles Barr actually says, well, it's reasonable to assume that the idea probably came from the writer Sam Taylor rather than Hitchcock, because there's a story about Hitchcock trying to actually cut the scene from Vertigo at the last minute before it's released, and Paramount weren't up for that, basically. And whether Hitchcock is as much to credit for it as he claims is an interesting thing to ponder. Actually, Taylor then, looking back on the film years later, said that the revelation could have come even earlier. It should have come, in his view, maybe after Scotty's breakdown. Then you make the revelation, then you carry on with the rest of the film. So, I don't know. I just think it's fascinating to kind of wonder about exactly how the film would change if you took that plot revelation and moved it somewhere slightly different in the sequence. I don't know. What do you think, Raquel? Do you think it's kind of ideally placed where it is? Would you rather have it somewhere else? How do you feel?
I think it ties nicely with the fact that she wrote him a letter explaining everything and she doesn't give it to him. And she chooses to basically try to get him because she had to let him go in that first cycle. And now she has an opportunity to, she's free of that other task that she has, and now she can have him. So she intentionally chooses not to reveal it and to be part of this new cycle, which becomes increasingly more dangerous. And she still continues. At any time she could give him that letter. So for me, I think actually that's perfectly placed because of the letter, because there's this intent to reveal, but she doesn't end up doing it.
Yeah, no, I think it's perfectly placed, and kind of like we were talking about earlier with the strange attitude to plotting. People might have looked at that first time and think, actually, like, this is odd that it comes here and not at maybe a more traditional last minute revelation or something. But I think it deepens the impact of the final third of the film. So I like it where it is for sure. Okay, so we've mentioned the tower sequences briefly, and I know you wanted to talk a bit more about the tower scenes, Raquel, didn't you? So what interested you about those? What interested you about those scenes?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because if you think about it, there's two storylines here. I like to call them cycles, the first cycle and the second cycle, and they both end with the bell tower. And because the first is where his love affair with Madeleine ends, and then the second one is where Judy eventually becomes Madeleine and he uncovers the truth. So I think it's interesting because and it's a great way to tap into that fear of like the fear of heights because it's a bell tower and it's so high up and it will induce this vertigo. It's a condition that taps into a vulnerable spot into the protagonist, which I think is why they chose it, even though that plot element of of Galvin with his real wife who seems to be drugged at the top of the tower just being shoved off, like they know that he's scared of heights, and this is a great way to kind of tap into that, basically that soft spot of his. And it's like the rising climax too of both stories. You have like the first one where he's chasing Madeleine up the bell tower, and the second one where he's forcing Judy up. And it's interesting because if you think about it, it's almost like the tower represents like his obsession, and it takes us into that escalating climax up to the top. And the conversations they both have, both like on their way up the tower, is interesting because in the first one, Madeleine is telling him, "No, it's too late. I have something to do," and Scotty's like, "No one possesses you. You're safe with me." But Madeleine says she's in love, but she has to, do what she has to do. And he thinks it's a suicide, but it ends up being something else. Now, in the second one, the conversation sort of flips, because you can see that Judy really wants to fulfill this desire to, have a romance with him. And she's desperate to try to make things different. And the conversation, she says, "Scotty, you loved me. Now keep me safe." And now it's his turn to say, "No, it's too late. There's no bringing her back." So now it's too late for Scotty, where it was like too late for Madeleine in the first scene. And I think it's just really interesting. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. I mean, the production code is still in effect in the 1950s. This is still the Hollywood studio system. And the production code, for those who don't know, was a form of self-governance that Hollywood used to regulate how sex, crime, and vice were depicted on screen. So had Scotty pushed Judy / Madeleine out of the tower and killed her, or like in the original novel, I think he strangles her. And maybe it's not in the tower, I'm not really quite sure, but he does kill her in the novel, but doesn't quite kill her here. If he had killed her, they would have had to have a sequence of events where he gets punished, because that was a very important part of the production code, is that if one of the main characters commits a crime, they must be punished for it. So having her fall is sort of like a workaround. It's sort of his murdering her, but not really. And I think it's interesting that it's the nun from the cloister who appears in the darkness and spooks her, and makes her fall out of the tower. That is actually what leads to her death. And if you think about it, Madeleine committed a crime at the beginning. She was complicit in the murder of this other woman. And this is sort of that way of pleasing the production code, saying that Madeleine has to pay for her crime, and her crime is paid for in her fall and death.
Yeah, it's kind of like we said earlier. The weird thing then, if you think of it that way, is that there's no signal that Elster is getting his comeuppance. Like we said,
Correct.
There is, at least in the version of the film that we see, there is an alternative ending to the film that people can see. It's on the Blu-ray I have, which I think may have been attached to the film in at least one country in its European release, but clearly we didn't see it in the English language release in the US and the UK. Where like the radio is Midge and Scotty, and the radio is on, and it's sort of saying the police are closing in on Elster, and that's kind of the detail you might
Oh,
expect
I have
to,
heard of this. Yeah.
yeah, it's the kind of thing you might expect to hear. Um, so yeah, it's kind of a period where the code is, like you say, it's still there, but it's weaker, right? So maybe you can
Right.
sneak
Right.
things through, like, yeah, Elster doesn't need to get his comeuppance, but it'd be harder to do that around the central character of the film, maybe, I would
Right.
guess. I'd love to see all the correspondence pertaining to this film and the censorship and so on. The only other thing I wanted to say about those tower sequences is just again about the incredible production of the film. Like, apparently, the bell tower set was like 70 feet high. You know, it's a fantastically elaborate construction because I think that mission that they went to, they kind of needed to make a new bell tower.
Yeah, it's
Um,
not actually part of the
yeah,
original one. Yeah.
yeah. So again, Henry Bumstead's production design, fantastic. Um, okay, so I think if anyone's wondering why we haven't explicitly mentioned the vertigo effect that we see in those towers, it is coming. It's just that there's lots to discuss with this film. It's finding the right place. And actually, that brings us to the any other business section where we go into anything else that's kind of interested us about the film or any other outside factors we want to explore. Um, and Raquel, I think you were interested in like maybe some of the earlier influences on Vertigo, perhaps. So do you want to take us into this one?
Yeah, I want to talk about two films in particular that have the same theme as Vertigo. They're both about men whose obsession with a woman kind of drives them mad. And both of these films are thought to be inspiration to Alfred Hitchcock in the making of Vertigo, even though Vertigo is based on a novel. It, especially the first one I'm going to talk about, definitely seems to have influenced Hitchcock. So the first one is Elle from 1953, which is directed by Luis Buñuel. It also goes by the title This Strange Passion. And this is one of my favorite Buñuel films. This is one of like many films that Buñuel made when he was in Mexico, and he worked with producers on like more traditional films. These are like plot driven and conventional, and they're very different from his like surrealist masterpieces, even though like these also have like a little touch of surrealism, which this one does. So Elle, it tells the story of Francisco. He's a middle-aged man. He's a member of the bourgeoisie, which is very typical Buñuel. He's a devout Catholic. So you see sort of those elements in Vertigo, middle-aged man. You see sort of like the upper echelons of society. You see the church and the nun. And in this story, Francisco is a virgin until he meets a young woman, falls for her, sweeps her off her feet, away from her fiance, and marries her. And even though he gets the girl and he consummates the marriage, he is in constant fear that his wife is going to leave him at any time, that he's cheating on him with another man, maybe that old fiance, or that she'll leave him for another reason. And the paranoia gets worse and worse as the story goes. He thinks people are laughing at him. In fact, that's where the surrealist element comes in, where he sees people bursting out in laughter, but then you get the shot that shows that no one's actually laughing. It's just his kind of distorted version of what he sees as reality. And it even escalates to the point where he tries to shoot his wife with a gun full of blanks just to scare her into submission. And there is a tower scene in this one. He brings her to a church, and church is like where the story starts and where it ends too. And he drags her up the bell tower, just like in Vertigo. And he basically, like, she's almost kind of falling off, like she's leaning too much, and he tries to strangle her. And then there's a scene of her like at a spiral staircase running down. And the tower element actually is in the original novel that Vertigo is based off of, but the way Buñuel shoots that scene seems to be very influential in how Hitchcock ends up shooting the tower scenes, in terms of like how it plays with camera angles and how the different shots kind of play up the tension. And Vertigo and Elle are similar if you think about it. They're Elle, Buñuel also said that his character was an extension of himself. So kind of goes with what you were saying before about the character of Scotty possibly being, an extension of Hitchcock. And also, Francisco in L is not a villain. He does bad things, but he is just seemed to be as flawed. Like Buñuel has talked about his character being moral and innocent, but just disturbed and interpreting reality. And then he believes that everyone is out to get him. Both stories have like this flawed hero who's not really a villain, but sort of a villain. And it's like a May December romance too. And then there's one other film I'll talk about quickly that could be an inspiration for this, which is a Russian silent film called Daydreams from 1915. It's directed by Yevgeny Bauer, and it's about this man, Sergei, who's distraught by the death of his beloved wife Yelena. And as he's his mourning, he discovers that this like local actress it has a striking resemblance to Yelena. So he tries to woo her, and he tries to fill that void from the loss of his wife, and he becomes obsessive and controlling, and he starts to push her away, and then he starts to see the ghost of his dead wife appear. And they do, like, this is a much earlier film, but there's like this technique where you kind of see this overlay of like this ghost haunting him. And just a reminder, every episode we make on CineHistorians has a dedicated letterbox list. So if you're trying to find the movies that we're talking about, they're all on there. So you just have to go to letterbox.com/cinehistorians.
Perfect. Thanks, Raquel. Okay, what I wanted to talk about is how Vertigo is a film that often gets kind of discussed in terms of the concept of the male gaze. And the male gaze is an expression that is used very commonly these days. And I think it's just interesting to sort of maybe walk some of that back and sort of talk about where it came from a little bit. So the idea of the male gaze is heavily associated with Laura Mulvey's essay from 1975 called Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. And it's a piece of psychoanalytic film analysis. And I don't want to get bogged down in the psychoanalytic context because we'll be talking about, we could talk about some of those theories all day. But basically, I'll just say that Laura Mulvey, writing that article, she's very interested in the ways films structure how the spectator sees images of women. And of course, Vertigo is a very interesting film in this respect for reasons that I think probably are obvious based on what we've already talked about. But one of the ways that cinema does this, in Mulvey's view, the way it structures images of women is through a voyeuristic approach, like an active way of seeing women that has this kind of distancing and objectifying effect. So she discusses how films produce voyeurism, and that can involve putting some level of distance between the male lead character and the female lead character. It can involve putting distance between the female protagonist in a film and the audience. And I think Vertigo is a great film to watch for an example of that, because even if you just watch the first third of the film, that great sequence where Scotty's driving, following Madeleine, the idea of distance, like he's following her from a distance to stay hidden from her. The camera is placed in his position. So the character of Madeleine is distanced not just from him as the lead character, but also from us as the viewer. So it's a great example of what Laura Mulvey would talk about in terms of the male gaze. She's also very interested in the idea of what's called fetishistic scopophilia, which is all about pleasure in looking. So when a female character is displayed as a beautiful object to be looked at. So she's very interested in the ways a film can have this fetishistic effect. So it could be through close-ups, it could be through lighting effects, through camera movement. And again, Vertigo is such a rich film to look at in relation to that, because if we talk back about that introduction scene I mentioned earlier, where she walks across Ernie's restaurant, Madeleine's definitely represented as a beautiful object of display in that scene. The character of Scotty looks at her. She doesn't do the looking. She is looked at, but she doesn't look. So there's actually an interesting script change there, because in the script, there's a momentary moment of eye contact where she looks at Scotty, but Hitchcock decided against it because he thought it might risk giving a bit of a hint to the audience that she's in on this trap that's been laid. So it's not in the final film. In terms of the male gaze, so Laura Mulvey talks about, you can have voyeurism, you can have fetishism. Often this kind of halts the narrative flow of the film because women are represented in this kind of passive way.
Yeah.
And again, we've talked about Vertigo being this really quite languid film, so it becomes highly interesting in that respect. Um, just one other thing I'll mention quickly there is it's also about the way that the camera movements can be kind of controlled by the male hero. So whether that's through the camera assuming like a point of view shot from the man's perspective, um, or whether it's just that the camera kind of follows the man and what he is looking at, that can be really relevant to this also. Um, so yeah, like I said, it's a 1975 essay. It's a very influential essay. Hitchcock's films are very interesting in relation to the idea of the male gaze because they do draw us into those perspectives of these uneasy male protagonists. And it is an absorbing, voyeuristic position to be in. But these are not films where these lead characters are like straightforward heroes because someone like Scotty is not an all powerful figure. You know, the fact that he has vertigo is the obvious example, and he has other frailties too. So, just to round off, I think it's such an interesting film in relation to this very popular still idea of the male gaze. And it's because it does both things really well. It shows you how there's a lot of pleasure to be had in that kind of voyeuristic looking. And it's also showing you that it's dangerous and manipulative and it's a construction. So I think when we talk about this film having layers, I think this is definitely an area where that's relevant. So yeah, I just
to
wanted
add
to
to that,
yeah,
just to add to that, like what you were saying about fetishization and then like the close-ups, there's like always discussion about how with the male gaze, sometimes the image of the woman is cut off to a certain body
yeah,
part, whether it's like a
yeah,
torso or the feet. There is a shot of her feet, Judy's feet, when she's being transformed into Madeleine. But I just think of that shot of the back of her head when she's in the museum, and that focus on the spiral in her
yeah.
hair, and that becomes that sort of visual trigger for him throughout the story. And that kind of speaks to that element of the male gaze of just kind of cutting it off to like one specific part that we fetishize through that gaze.
Absolutely. And I think it's a film like that scene in Ernie's again, where she walks into this kind of side on close up as well, for
Yeah.
example, would be another example of how we're denied like a full look at her, but she's presented to us in quite a fetishistic manner. So
And that's
yeah,
repeated later on, and she's
yeah,
in dark in the silhouette, and it's the green behind her, and it's the same shot, just facing a different direction. You can even line them up, and they're kind of looking at each other. But you're
yeah,
right, like you can't quite get an image of her. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so Raquel, I know you've just earlier talked about some earlier films that preceded Vertigo, and I think you're also interested in films that came later as well, and that Vertigo
Yes.
influenced subsequently. So yeah, what do you want to tell us about that?
I wanted to talk about Chris Marker. He was this very mysterious figure in film history. He was experimental. He was very secretive. He was a filmmaker, photographer, artist, and he's most associated with the French New Wave, in particular the Left Bank, which we talked about in the first season when we were talking about Cleo from 5 to 7. So Chris Marker has two films on the Sight and Sound Top 100 list from 2022. La Jetée from 1962, which is tied for 67th place, and Sans Soleil from 1983, which is at the 59th spot. And La Jetée, these both films were actually inspired by Vertigo. La Jetée is like a science fiction short film. It's made completely out of still images and spoken narration, and it imagines time travel in a Paris of the future, both pre and post World War II. There's a lot going on. And one of the things in particular is that the protagonist in the story is haunted by an image he saw as a boy, and that image ends up sealing his fate. You can sort of make that parallel with like Madeleine and Vertigo, being this woman haunted by, or she's playing this woman being haunted by an image of an ancestor. That whole performance later that seals her fate, and that ends up being her destiny as well, because like it's understood that the image of the woman, that woman ended up committing suicide. And then we learn that she's going to suffer a death to a tragic fall. And then there's also like structurally and there's also visual references to Vertigo, but Sans Soleil is actually where we see Vertigo addressed directly. And that one is like a documentary / travelogue that has like these interesting like meditations on like memory and the human experience, and it shows like different cultures throughout. There's a 4-minute segment devoted to Vertigo. It's this little mini video essay, which includes images from the movie, but also clips from Chris Marker's pilgrimage to San Francisco, where he visits the locations where Vertigo was shot. He went to the floral shop and he finds that the tiles are still the same on the floor. They go to the church cemetery, the hotel, the first hotel where Madeleine mysteriously enters but isn't seen, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Redwood Forest. They even see like the cross section that both Madeleine and Scotty are examining. And they even go to the mission and find that fake horse. And also they make note that the tower isn't actually there, but you get kind of a shot of where the tower would have been. And all the while in this like scene, there's a woman's voice narrating and talking about like the pilgrimage, and it's extrapolating on like Vertigo being thematic of like power and freedom and melancholy, and how like the Vertigo elements, the spiral, are symbolic of time and reality. It's actually quite poetic in how it approaches it. But what's interesting about this is actually it reveals that Chris Marker had seen Vertigo 19 times by this point. Who knows how many times he saw it after? And like you said, you know, Vertigo wasn't that readily available in the years after it was released. So the fact that Chris Marker saw it 19 times, probably in a theater, shows how much he loved this movie and possibly kickstarted his career as a filmmaker. And I just think it's interesting that Vertigo, being the number 2 on this list, influenced 2 other films further down the list.
Yeah, and I'd actually briefly considered La Jetée as one of my picks, actually, because I think that's a very powerful film. And I've shown that film to people before who've been really like struck by it. And, you know, I kind of thought that would be an interesting one to do. It'd probably be the shortest film we ever covered if we did do it.
It's only like 28 minutes.
Yeah, but yeah, very interesting. Yeah, so maybe Chris Marker was going to some kind of illicit screenings of the film or something. It kind of sounds like fair play. I quickly wanted to talk about what Hitchcock himself has said about Vertigo, and in particular, one book I've always looked at whenever I've done a podcast involving a Hitchcock film is the Hitchcock Truffaut book, which actually eagle-eyed viewers on YouTube may be able to see over Raquel's shoulder right now on the bookshelf, where the filmmaker Francois Truffaut spoke at length to Hitchcock about most of his career. So I had a look at what they said about Vertigo. Truffaut asks Hitchcock what appealed about the book, and Hitchcock said he was intrigued by the hero's attempts to recreate the image of a dead woman through another one who's alive. He actually compares it to a type of necrophilia. So he was thinking about it in those terms. To go back to what I was saying earlier, there's this discussion around the revelation about Judy's identity, because Hitchcock talks about how that comes at the end of the book, but obviously there's a different approach for the film. And Hitchcock said, everyone around me was against this change. They all felt that the revelation should be saved for the end of the picture. So like I said earlier, that account is kind of questioned by Charles Barr in the BFI's book. But in Hitchcock's retelling, it's all about his choice, basically. So we need to put a bit of an asterisk on that. What Hitchcock says is that it's all about the difference between suspense and surprise. And elsewhere in the same book, he's given this story about the difference between what suspense is versus what surprise is. So the story he tells is like, we're having a very innocent conversation. There's a bomb underneath the table. Nothing happens. All of a sudden, boom, the bomb explodes. That's surprise. The public is surprised, but they had no sense that was coming. Hitchcock said actually a suspenseful situation is that the bomb is under the table. The public knows the bomb is under the table. They know what time the bomb is going to explode. And therefore, the same innocuous conversation becomes highly fascinating because the audience is in on it. So the audience is wanting to warn the characters that the bomb is about to explode. So in that situation, you have suspense. And Hitchcock's conclusion is whenever you can, the public needs to be kept informed, basically. So he relates that idea of suspense v surprise to that choice being made in Vertigo. And like I said, it does shift the onus between the audience and the James Stewart character because, yeah, we do now have more information than he does. And we're kind of waiting for that to play out, like I said. He says a few interesting things. He talks about like using that the green light from the neon sign, like you had talked about with the colors, Raquel, to create that kind of ghost-like effect in that scene. What we should definitely mention with this film is the vertigo effect itself. So this is when Scotty looks down. So it happens early in the film, in the opening sequence, and also in the tower sequences later on. When he looks down and there's that kind of disorientating effect. Hitchcock tells a story of getting drunk one night at the Albert Hall in London, and he has this sensation that everything's going far away from him. He had wanted to try and capture that in the film Rebecca. There's a scene where Joan Fontaine's character faints in Rebecca, but couldn't work out how to do it. What he says is that he was kind of thinking about this problem on and off for 15 years. And then Vertigo comes along, and he's told it would cost a lot of money to do this because you'd have to put a camera at the top of the stairs in the tower. You'd need a big apparatus to lift it up. You'd need it to be kind of counterweighted so it could be held up. It would probably cost something like $50,000, which in 1958 money is a lot of money. The solution was quite elegant. It was to make a miniature model of the staircase and to put it on its side. So if you did that, you could do it much cheaper. Hitchcock says $19,000, not $50,000. So I really like the ingenuity there.
He could always find a way.
Yeah, no, he did have that kind of problem-solving attitude, I think. Final thing from the Hitchcock-Truffaut book that jumped out is, again, it goes back to what we've discussed all the way through this episode, which is the plotting, which is that Truffaut kind of says to Hitchcock, it sounds like you really like Vertigo. And Hitchcock doesn't respond by saying, actually, yeah, I do. I really like this film. He sort of says, well, there's this flaw in the story that's always bugged me. How could Elster have been absolutely sure that Scotty wouldn't make it up the stairs? So again, it goes back to the whole thing we discussed, Raquel, of the plausibility, whether or not it matters. And like we said, it sounded like the critics in 1958 felt it mattered more than people coming to the film later on have generally felt, you know?
Right.
But Hitchcock wasn't oblivious to that. Hitchcock was definitely thinking about things like that too. The other thing with the vertigo effect, just quickly, Raquel, is like we've seen that in other movies, of course, haven't we? So we talked about Jaws on season 1. Jaws does the vertigo effect in the scene with Chief Brody at the beach as things are starting to kick off. I think in Goodfellas, there's a scene that does this kind of effect out the window of the cafe where Robert De Niro and Ray Liotta are sat. So I think a lot of filmmakers have been tempted to kind of tip their hat to Hitchcock over the years, to be honest. And I think it's fair enough.
Yeah.
You've got a book, Raquel. It's a good resource, isn't it? It's a good thing for listeners to read potentially.
Yeah, I kind of call it film school in a book because it's just two filmmakers talking specifically about Hitchcock's work, but they talk about technique and Hitchcock is quite revelatory about like what he thinks went wrong with some of his films, which I think also kind of shows, you know, because like as you said, as you hinted on earlier, that Hitchcock often would like change the narrative a little bit of what his interpretation of things were, but this feels very raw and honest, just this conversation, and it's interpreted because Truffaut speaking French, Hitchcock speaking English, and they have somebody in between them, but you learn so much about filmmaking. And my biggest takeaway from the book is I think Hitchcock said filmic time is not the same as real time, so you can't really show things in real time, although like we kind of see that with Gene Dealman, so you can, but in terms of like a story, it doesn't always make sense to show things in real time. Sometimes you have to cut out a little bit to keep the flow going or to keep the momentum or to get to your point. It's kind of like when somebody picks up a phone, has a conversation, doesn't say goodbye. Do you need the goodbye? Like, can you cut that time and use that for something else?
Yeah, no, probably quite a good example of that in Vertigo would be like when he has saved her from the water And there's a moment where they're back at his place. The phone rings. He talks on the phone briefly, and then she leaves. And actually, if you time it strictly on the stopwatch, I'm not sure she has that much time to get her clothes on and get out the door. But actually, in film time, it feels about right. It's probably about 45 seconds or something.
Right.
So it's a good example of that, I think, potentially.
Oh, that is.
Okay, so Raquel, probably time to start saying our goodbyes. But before we do, a quick preview of the next episode, which, if I'm not mistaken, it's another one of my picks next time, isn't it? So do you want to do the honor of telling people what we're talking about on the next episode?
Yes, we're talking about Bicycle Thieves from 1948.
Yeah, and we'll get into this next time, but it's another film with kind of a special history on the Sight and Sound list. So we'll definitely talk about that at some detail next time. Okay, Raquel, a pleasure as ever.
Yes. This could have been a 2-hour episode, to be honest. We could have just kept going to a part 2.
Could have been a mini-series, absolutely. But it's a great film that deserves that kind of like extended. We've taken our time a little bit anyway. Yes, so yeah, I hope people have enjoyed this discussion. Just the usual reminders to round off. I think that we would love listeners to rate and review the podcast. If you're an Apple listener, or if you're on Spotify or any other platform that's got like a 5-star quick rate and review thing, that would be fantastic. Just a 1-line review would be fantastic as well. If you possibly could, it would help new people find our show. And what can people do on YouTube, Raquel, if they want to support us over there?
They can smash the subscribe button and turn on the notifications so you don't ever miss an episode.
Great stuff. All right. Well, thanks for joining us for this episode, everybody. And we'll see you next time. Take care and bye for now. You can find the CineHistorians at cinehistorians.com and on X, Letterboxd, and YouTube at CineHistorians.
If you're interested in supporting the show, please consider leaving us a Ko-fi. You can find our Ko-fi link and all of our other links in the show notes. Thank you for listening and happy viewing.